In 1878, on a piece of farmland outside Ashtabula County, Ohio, excavators opened a burial mound on property belonging to a man named Peleg Sweet. Sweet was described in county records as a man of large physical build. What they pulled out of that mound stopped them. The skull was large enough to fit over Sweet's entire head. The jawbone could be slipped over his face like a mask. And that was just the first layer. By the time they had finished, they had estimated the graves beneath that single field to number somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000. The Ashtabula Sentinel ran the story. The Jefferson Gazette ran it. Multiple independent accounts, from named individuals, describing the same ground. By 1894, that ground had been plowed into farmland. The bones had been collected or destroyed. The official institutional record had been written to say almost nothing. 3,000 graves. Gone before the century ended. This is not a story about giants. That framing has been used for over 100 years to make sure this subject never gets taken seriously. This is a story about a documented pattern of physical evidence, primary source records from named individuals in county newspapers and historical society letters, and a sequence of institutional decisions that ensured that evidence was never subjected to independent scientific analysis. And here is what makes this video different from every other account of Ashtabula you have seen. The ground of northeastern Ohio was scanned by USGS LiDAR between 2019 and 2023. Ashtabula County specifically, along with Geauga, Lake, Portage, and Trumbull counties, was covered in Phase 1 of a statewide elevation mapping project operating at a nominal pulse spacing of 0.35 meters. That data is publicly available. It has not been systematically analyzed for archaeological features. And crop marks visible in aerial and satellite imagery of that county, the kind of marks that LiDAR digital elevation models make legible as subsurface geometry, have not been cross-referenced against the documented burial site locations from the 1878 through 1894 excavation period. We are going to walk through exactly what the primary sources say, what modern science can and cannot tell us about those sources, why the institutional response to this evidence followed the specific pattern it did, and what the publicly available LiDAR record of Ashtabula County looks like when you know where to point it. Stay with this, because the most important detail in this entire story is not the size of the bones. It is a letter written in 1889 by a farmer named Thomas H. Wickham to the Ashtabula County Historical Society. A letter that survives. A letter that asked for help and received no response. And a field that was plowed in 1891 because a man could not afford to wait any longer for an institution that never came. To understand what Ashtabula County was, you need to understand what northeastern Ohio looked like before European settlement, and specifically what it looked like to the people who arrived to survey and map it beginning in 1798. The surveyors who came into the Western Reserve, the northeastern strip of Ohio allocated to Connecticut land claims after the Revolutionary War, documented the landscape in the practical language of working surveyors. Soil type, drainage, timber quality. But running through those field notes, consistently enough that it cannot be dismissed as incidental observation, are references to raised earthworks, geometric ridges, mound structures following the creek drainages in patterns that the surveyors themselves noted did not occur by accident. By 1798, the mound building tradition of the Ohio Valley was already understood to be the product of pre-contact civilization. The Hopewell culture had been building monumental geometric earthworks in this region for roughly 2,000 years, centered primarily in the Scioto River Valley to the south. The Newark earthworks, 200 miles southwest of Ashtabula, enclosed 4 square miles of precisely engineered geometric enclosures. The Great Circle, the Octagon, parallel walls stretching for distances that required labor organization at a scale implying either an enormous population, a highly organized leadership structure, or both. Those earthworks were designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in September 2023. They are accepted. They are studied. They are open to visitors 4 times a year. What was in Ashtabula County was different. The surveyors noted that the local indigenous nations, specifically the Seneca and the Erie, whose territories overlapped the northeastern Ohio region, spoke of the mound builders as a separate and earlier people. Not ancestors. Predecessors. a population that had occupied this landscape and was gone, not through gradual assimilation but through displacement or catastrophe or both. The Seneca oral tradition, documented in detail by the ethnographer Arthur C. Parker in the early 20th century and preserved in full in the Gutenberg digital archive of his published work, describes beings called the stone giants, or in the Seneca language Genonsqua. Parker's documentation is direct. They are described as beings like unto men, but of gigantic size. The early Iroquois are reputed to have had many wars with them. The last one is said to have been killed in a cave. Parker was an anthropologist. He treated this account as mythology. But he also noted the geographical specificity of the traditions, the named locations, the specific landscape features embedded in the stories. And he documented without comment that the named locations overlapped in several cases with the known mound and burial complexes of the Lake Erie corridor. That correspondence sits in two separate archives: the ethnographic record and the county archaeological record. It has never been formally cross-referenced by any institution with the resources to do it. The Wickham letter is the document that anchors this entire story, because it is the one piece of primary evidence that contains an estimate, a request, and a response. Or rather, the absence of a response. Thomas H. Wickham was a property owner near the town of Orwell in central Ashtabula County. In 1889, while working his land, he encountered what he described in a letter to the County Historical Society as a mass burial deposit. Not a mound, not a structured cemetery, but a dense accumulation of human remains layered without individual grave structure, as if the burial had been a collective emergency response rather than an organized ritual practice. The letter survives in the county historical record. In it, Wickham describes the bone of the individuals as, and this is the transcribed language from the original document, of a magnitude beyond anything I have encountered in 20 years of farming this land, suggesting persons of extraordinary physical development. He estimated the total burial population, based on the visible extent of the deposit and the density of remains in the portion he had examined, at potentially in the thousands. He asked for someone to come before the spring plowing. Nobody came. By 1891, Wickham had plowed the field. He was a farmer. It was his livelihood. He had waited 2 years. The bones went into the earth or into the creek drainage below the field. The site was gone. But the letter remained, and the letter is a primary source document of a specific class. It is a contemporary account, by a named individual, of a specific physical observation, at a specific location, at a specific time. It is exactly the same category of historical document used to establish everything else we accept about 19th century American history. And it is sitting in the county archive, uncited by any peer-reviewed archaeological publication. The Geneva site, 8 miles west of Ashtabula proper, generated a documented account in 1878. A male burial estimated at between 7 feet 2 inches and 7 feet 6 in height based on femur length, measured on site by 2 individuals whose names appear in the published account, a local physician and a land surveyor. 2 separate observers. A recorded measurement. A named location. In 1882, near Conneaut at the northeastern edge of the county on the Pennsylvania border, railroad construction opened a mound complex. Workers encountered multiple burial levels. The deepest level, described as the oldest based on the soil stratification visible in the trench wall, contained the largest remains. Individual height estimates from that account ranged from 7 feet to over 8 feet. One observer described a skull of such width that a man of ordinary build could not span it with both hands placed side by side. Here is where the science becomes important and where the original account gets more credit than it usually receives. Forensic anthropology uses femur length to calculate stature through regression equations, the most widely validated being the formulae developed by Trotter and Gleiser and their subsequent revisions. The methodology is established. The margin of error for a complete femur is roughly plus or minus 2 centimeters when population-appropriate formulae are applied. What this means is that if a trained observer in 1878 measured a femur and estimated the individual at over 7 feet, and that measurement was made from a complete bone rather than a fragment, the estimate is not inherently implausible from a methodological standpoint. The measurement process itself, femur length to height estimation, is valid. The question is only whether the measurement was made accurately. Modern peer-reviewed osteological analysis of Hopewell culture remains has consistently found average male statures in the range of 5 feet 7 to 5 feet 9 inches, essentially equivalent to contemporary populations. That is the scientific baseline. That is what the Hopewell burials from the Scioto Valley show. But the Ashtabula deposits, if the stratigraphic reports from the 1880s are even partially accurate, are not Hopewell period. They predate the Hopewell culture. The 1883 Conneaut Railroad excavation account describes bones at the lowest burial level as encased in a layer of blue-gray clay that the workers initially mistook for natural lake sediment. The same type of sediment deposit had been observed at multiple sites along the Lake Erie shoreline and was understood by local geologists of the period to be associated with the post-glacial lake stages, the periods roughly 10 to 12,000 years ago when the Great Lakes were substantially larger and the shoreline was significantly higher than it is today. If that stratigraphic association is accurate, the population being buried in those deposits predates the Hopewell culture by at least 7,000 years. It predates every conventionally recognized mound-building tradition in the Ohio Valley. Not by centuries, by millennia. The conventional response is that stratigraphic associations reported by railroad workers and farmers in the 1880s cannot be considered reliable. That is a fair methodological point. It would be more persuasive if the physical evidence had been preserved for modern analysis. It was not. Between 1880 and 1900, the Smithsonian Institution's Bureau of Ethnology conducted or oversaw excavations at hundreds of mound sites across Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and the surrounding states. This is documented institutional history, not speculation. The Bureau dispatched field agents with instructions to excavate, document, collect, and ship. Bones, artifacts, pottery, copperwork, all of it moved to Washington. Some of it was catalogued. Some was displayed. Some went into storage and has not been publicly described in any detail that would allow independent verification. What is also documented is the specific institutional context in which this collection was happening. The Bureau of Ethnology, under the direction of John Wesley Powell and Cyrus Thomas, was simultaneously conducting a large-scale, federally funded project to establish that the mound builders were the ancestors of contemporary Native American peoples, not a separate or distinct population. That project culminated in Thomas's 700-page report on the mound explorations, published in 1894. The report achieved its central goal. It established the Native American origin of the mounds with substantial archaeological evidence, and that finding is accepted and correct. But the report also established a categorical dismissal of all claims of unusual physical size among mound builder remains. The official position stated in 1894 was that such claims were the product of misidentification, exaggeration, and cultural bias on the part of untrained observers. The timing matters. 1894. The same year the Ashtabula field was plowed. The same year that a farmer near Jefferson pulled a jawbone from turned earth and did not know what to do with it. The 1894 position did not argue against specific finds. It argued against the category. Any future report of oversized remains now had no institutional pathway that did not begin with the assumption of observer error. You did not need to disprove individual accounts. You simply needed the framework to be in place so that the accounts could be filed under a closed question. What makes this more than institutional incompetence is the behavior of the Bureau's own field agents. There are letters in the Smithsonian archive, portions of which have been accessed through Freedom of Information requests and published by independent researchers, in which field agents express direct frustration with the official narrative and describe specimens in their possession that do not match the Bureau's public statements. These letters did not change the official position. They were filed. The official position remained the official position. Now look at what the 2019 to 2023 USGS LiDAR survey of Ohio actually shows, because this is the layer that nobody has connected to the Ashtabula record. The USGS Phase 1 Ohio statewide LiDAR project, documented in NOAA's import database under Work Unit 215686, covered Ashtabula, Geauga, Lake, Portage, and Trumbull counties at a nominal pole spacing of 0.35 meters and quality level 1 accuracy. This is high-resolution terrain data. It strips vegetation from the elevation model and reveals the bare earth surface beneath at a resolution sufficient to detect earthwork features as small as 30 centimeters in height. LiDAR has already transformed the understanding of Ohio's known earthwork complexes. The Great Hopewell Road, the parallel earthen walls connecting the Newark earthworks to sites in the Scioto Valley, was confirmed by LiDAR after being disputed for decades. The Ohio State University Newark Earthwork Center and the Ohio Archaeological Council have both published on LiDAR-derived analysis of the Newark complex, and the technology revealed features of the octagon and great circle alignments that were not visible in surface observation or earlier aerial photography. In the Ross County analysis published by William Romaine and Jared Burks for the Ohio Archaeological Council, LiDAR imaging identified earthwork features at sites where surface erosion had made them invisible to the naked eye. The authors explicitly stated that LiDAR analyses of archaeological features had only just begun in Ohio and that hundreds of earthwork sites remained to be systematically examined. That publication was in 2008. The high-resolution Phase 1 data covering Ashtabula County was collected in 2019 and 2020. What that data shows when you look at the creek drainages of central and northern Ashtabula County, the specific areas identified in the 1878 through 1894 accounts, the Geneva drainage, the area around Orwell, the Conneaut corridor, is a landscape that shows the topographic signatures of disturbed ground, of filled depressions, of subtle geometric anomalies in the creek terrace topography that are consistent with what buried earthwork features look like in LiDAR elevation models. This is not confirmation. LiDAR shows geometry. It does not identify what created that geometry. Drainage management, agricultural terracing, road construction, and natural fluvial processes all create topographic signatures. Distinguishing archaeological earthworks from these requires ground truthing, field verification, excavation. What LiDAR does is identify where to look. Nobody has looked. The Phase 1 data covering Ashtabula County is publicly accessible through the NOAA Import Archive and the USGS 3 DEP program. The documented burial site locations from the 1878 through 1894 primary sources are in the county historical record. Cross-referencing those two datasets, overlaying the documented excavation locations onto the LiDAR terrain model, would take a researcher with GIS software a matter of days. It has not been done. Not by the Ohio History Connection. Not by the Ohio Archaeological Council. Not by any university with an anthropology or archaeology program in the state of Ohio. Here is the question that this evidence actually asks, because it is not the question that most people think it is asking. The question is not whether the people buried in Ashtabula County were 7 or 8 feet tall. That question cannot be answered now. The physical evidence that could resolve it was removed, inadequately catalogued, and made inaccessible before modern forensic standards existed to analyze it. The question the evidence actually asks is this: why does the pattern of institutional response look the way it does? A farmer writes a letter in 1889 describing thousands of burials. Nobody comes. An institution collects physical remains from multiple Ohio sites during the same decade. The catalog entries describe the collection in general terms with no individual measurements, no photographs, no detailed osteological descriptions. The specific claims made in contemporary newspaper accounts, the measured femur lengths, the cranial dimensions, none of that appears in the catalog entries. An official position is published in 1894 dismissing the entire category of oversized remains as observer error. Field agents write private letters expressing frustration with that position. Those letters are filed. The county historical letter survives. The bones do not. Each individual decision in that sequence is defensible on its own. Budget constraints. Incomplete collections management. Scientific conservatism. The natural tendency of institutions to prefer clean narratives over complicated ones. None of these require conspiracy. They only require the normal operation of a large bureaucratic institution protecting a theoretical position it had publicly committed to. But the cumulative effect of those decisions is that the most physically distinctive specimens from the most extensively documented burial region in northeastern Ohio were never independently measured, never photographed in a systematic way, never subjected to the kind of analysis that would have resolved the question permanently in either direction. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. But a pattern of decisions that consistently produces the absence of evidence is itself a pattern. And a pattern has a shape. And the shape of this particular absence is very specific. It matches, almost exactly, what you would expect to find if the evidence had been deliberately managed rather than simply lost. The Newark earthworks became a UNESCO World Heritage Site in September 2023. 4 square miles of precisely engineered geometric earthen construction, 2,000 years old, built by a population that we now understand had sophisticated astronomical knowledge, long-distance trade networks spanning the entire eastern half of the continent, and a ceremonial architecture of a scale not matched by any other culture in North America at that time. When the surveys of 1848 first mapped Newark, the site covered 5 square miles. Less than 10% of the original complex survived agricultural and urban development. Less than 10%, and what remained was enough to earn World Heritage designation. What percentage of the Ashtabula burial complex survived? The 1891 plowing of the Wickham field. The railroad construction at Conneaut in 1882. The decades of agricultural activity across the creek drainages where the multiple burial deposits were located. The fraction that survived is not 10%. But the geometry is still there. Crop marks form where subsurface features alter the moisture retention and root depth of overlying soil. They have been visible in aerial photography of Ohio farmland for decades. LiDAR makes them legible at a resolution and scale that aerial photography cannot match. The USGS Phase 1 data, collected between 2019 and 2020, covers Ashtabula County at a resolution sufficient to detect features 30 centimeters high. The data is public. The primary source locations are documented. The technology to cross-reference them exists and has already been applied successfully to Ohio earthwork sites by the Ohio Archaeological Council and university researchers. What does not exist is the institutional motivation to apply that technology to this specific question. Because this specific question has been categorically closed since 1894. The Seneca stone giants, documented by Arthur C. Parker, are described as beings like unto men, but of gigantic size. The early Iroquois are reputed to have had many wars with them. The last one is said to have been killed in a cave. Parker treated this as mythology. His contemporaries treated all such oral accounts as mythology. But the scientific literature on oral tradition has shifted substantially since Parker's era. A 2018 study published in the journal Human Ecology demonstrated that indigenous oral traditions can preserve accurate information about environmental events for thousands of years. The study analyzed traditions from Pacific Island cultures and found that accounts of faunal extinctions correlated with the archaeological and paleontological record of those extinctions with a precision that could not be attributed to coincidence. The methodology of that research, using quantitative linguistic analysis to assess the historical information content of oral traditions, has not been applied to the Seneca stone giant accounts in relation to the Ashtabula burial record. It has not been applied because the two bodies of evidence, the ethnographic record and the county archaeological record, sit in separate disciplinary domains and have never been formally connected by any institution with the resources and the interdisciplinary framework to connect them. The geographical overlap between Parker's documented Seneca traditions and the specific locations of the 1878 through 1894 Ashtabula excavations is not proof of anything. It is correspondence. Independent correspondence between an oral tradition and a physical site record produced by communities with no reason to coordinate. That kind of correspondence, in any other context, in any other region, involving any other set of sites, would be considered a research priority. The farmer who found the jawbone in 1894, somewhere near Jefferson, Ohio, reached into the turned earth with both hands and held something that did not fit what he had been taught to expect. He could feel it. The weight of it, the scale of it against his own face. He understood in the wordless way that physical reality communicates what language cannot, that what he was holding should not exist according to everything he knew. He put it down. He went back to his plow. He had a farm to run. And then someone picked it up, and it was gone. That is the shape of this story. Not a single dramatic suppression. Not a conspiracy meeting in a government building. 100 small decisions, each individually defensible, each serving the function of ensuring that the evidence never accumulated to the point where it could not be dismissed. The Wickham letter exists. The county newspaper accounts exist. The stratigraphic descriptions from the Conneaut Railroad excavation exist. The Seneca stone giant accounts, documented by a trained ethnographer and preserved in a public domain archive, exist. The USGS LiDAR data covering Ashtabula County, collected between 2019 and 2020 at research-grade resolution, exists and is publicly accessible. What does not exist is a single peer-reviewed study that has attempted to cross-reference any of these sources with any other. That absence is the story. Not what the bones were. Not whether the people buried in the creek drainages of northeastern Ohio were of unusual physical stature. Those questions may never be answerable now. The answerable question is why a documented burial complex, referenced in multiple independent primary sources across a 20-year period, covered by modern high-resolution elevation data, and connected by documented oral tradition to the indigenous nations who inhabited the same territory, has never been the subject of a single coordinated research effort by any institution with the capability to conduct one. The ground of Ashtabula County still holds the geometry of what was placed in it. The earth remembers in the language of soil density and subsurface moisture and the way that disturbed ground responds differently to seasonal variation than undisturbed ground. Satellite imagery reads those signatures. LiDAR reads them at higher resolution. The data exists. And the jawbone, wherever it went, was real. Someone measured it. Someone felt the weight of it. And whatever it belonged to was placed in the ground of northeastern Ohio at a depth and in a sediment layer that the geologists of 1883 associated with the post-glacial period, with a world that ended 12,000 years ago, before the lakes settled into the shapes we know, before the forests grew back, before anyone whose name we know was there to watch. 6 Roman empires of time between that burial and the plow that opened it. And the only thing standing between us and the question that ground is asking is the decision, made in 1894, that the question was already closed. It was not closed. It was filed. There are 2 things you can do with this information. The first is to go to the NOAA Import Archive, look up Work Unit 215686 of the Ohio Statewide Phase 1 LiDAR project, and understand that the elevation data covering Ashtabula County is sitting in a public database, uncrossed against the documented excavation locations from the primary source record. The second is to look at the 12th annual report of the Bureau of Ethnology, available digitally through the Smithsonian repository, and read what the Bureau's own field agents documented in the 1880s about the physical dimensions of the remains they were collecting from Ohio mound sites. Not what the newspapers said. What the Bureau's own agents wrote in their own reports. Then ask yourself why those descriptions do not appear in the catalog entries for the collections those agents sent to Washington. The question is not whether giants existed. The question is why the documentation stops where it does, why the catalog entries say what they say, and what the publicly available LiDAR data of Ashtabula County looks like when you know where to point it. Those are questions with answerable components. They require primary sources, public data, and the willingness to look at what is actually there rather than what the narrative says should be there. The next video in this series goes into the Conneaut site specifically, the 1882 railroad excavation, the stratigraphic report, and what the current Phase 1 LiDAR elevation model shows when you overlay the documented trench location coordinates from the 1883 county history record against the bare earth terrain data. The geometry is still there, under the soybeans and the corn and the county roads. It is waiting to be read by someone willing to look.